Hello, I'm Natasha Loder, the health editor at The Economist. Welcome to the latest webinar in our Cell and Gene Insight Hour series. Gene therapies and gene editing are marketed as one-time treatments that have the potential to stop disease progression and, in many instances, restore function. They show promise for treating rare and debilitating diseases with limited or no treatment options. Many countries around the world have welcomed these treatments, such as the new gene editing therapy Casgevy for sickle cell anemia. The route to the adoption of new medical technologies happens after an assessment of their value is made. However, there's been industry concern that these health technology assessments present unique challenges for one-time therapies. For example, such therapies are typically developed around small patient populations that offer more limited evidence, and the studies do not follow patients for the length of time that it's hoped that they will benefit. This Insight Hour will explore how these health technology assessments work for cell and gene therapies. How should stakeholders and healthcare systems evaluate them? Is the push to consider the societal value of these therapies reasonable? Is the HTA framework the problem, or is the issue the lack of incentive to support science and innovation? Or even simply that these therapies are at an early stage of development and a better business model with lower costs is yet to emerge? Lastly, what can regulators, drug companies, researchers and patients do to reconcile their interests and needs for evidence in a way that ensures patients' timely access to innovative therapies and ensuring value for healthcare systems? With me today is an esteemed panel, and it's my pleasure to welcome them. I'd like to introduce first Jennifer Lee from Johnson & Johnson. She's Senior Director in Health Economics, Market Access and Reimbursement at Johnson & Johnson Innovative Medicine in Copenhagen. She's a trained health economist and a biochemist with extensive experience in market access, policy and government affairs across multiple regions. Next is Lottie Stoughton, who is the Deputy Chief Executive of the Office of Health Economics, and she leads its international research. She's also a visiting honorary professor at City University of London and an associate editor for Value in Health. Lottie specialises in quantitative methods for assessing health and economic benefits of healthcare interventions. Next is Meindert Boyston, an independent expert in HTAs. He's also chair of HTAI's Global Policy Forum. Previously, he was the Director of Health Technology Evaluation Programs and Deputy CEO at NICE. Meindert has extensive experience in health technology assessment. Next is Bart Leroy at Ghent University Hospital. Bart is a professor of ophthalmology, ophthalmic genetics, and visual electrophysiology at Ghent University, and he also heads the ophthalmology department at Ghent University Hospital. He's a clinical geneticist specialising in inherited eye disorders and was involved in bringing gene therapy Luxturna to market. Last is Avril Daly, Chief Executive of Retina International, a global patient-led organisation representing charities focused on retina research and health policy. Avril also serves as the President of Rare Diseases Europe and is affected by retinitis pigmentosa. Welcome to you all. It's a great pleasure to have you here today. I wonder if we could start by setting the stage. And Jennifer, perhaps you can start by explaining what gene therapies are and the sort of unique benefits they offer, particularly in addressing debilitating and rare diseases, and also perhaps what makes them special.
So I think gene therapies are probably the most exciting health technology that's come around in my lifetime, certainly, because you're really talking about either intercepting a disease before it actually starts or becomes symptomatic for the patient, or you're talking about potential cures for some of these treatments that are coming in the pipeline. So incredibly exciting. Nothing we've ever seen before falls into this type of category. So obviously from an industry perspective, super excited about it. I think the potential, though, to offer a cure or intercept a disease when healthcare systems in general are set up to treat symptomatic patients and to pay for that is where the gap is. But we should not be dismayed by that, because the science is moving incredibly fast, and there's so many amazing treatments coming down the pipeline for patients, particularly with rare disease. But I think what you're going to see over the next 10 years is also gene therapies moving into more prevalent disease spaces.
Lottie, considering the EU HTA regulation, how well equipped would you say current methodologies are in evaluating gene therapies, especially regarding the long-term value and uncertainty in the data?
That's a very good question. Of course, the JCA has only been implemented in January 2025, so we will see how the results will look like, but they're absolutely focusing on, indeed, conditions that can be treated by gene therapies. So I guess what I can say sort of just before the JCA came in place, and I think that's still relevant, because even when the JCA is implemented, each individual country will still do its health technology assessment on its own. So as soon as costs are coming into play, each country will still do it in the way they want to do it. But of course, they're now working off like a harmonized evidence based on clinical efficacy mostly. I guess the challenges we saw, therefore, with HTA will be similar to what we've seen before 2025 to some extent. And those are sort of the three main ones, in my perspective, are that there's lots of value that's generated by gene therapies, not only to the individual patient and the healthcare system, but also to their families, their carers, in terms of their own productivity, people around them. And those elements are not typically captured in HTA before 2025, and also surely not as part of the JCA. They might be in the HTA in the national level, and some countries are actually doing that, but most countries are not. And by sort of overlooking that, there is a risk that we underestimate the value of those therapies. The second thing is the long-term uncertainty is always, of course, going to be a challenge, because when do we know that a cure is a cure, and how do we even define what a cure really looks like? So that is going to be difficult for HTA agencies to deal with. And then thirdly, what happens with gene therapies? Typically, we pay for them, particularly when these are like one-off therapies, we pay for them today. We would like to capture all that value in the value-based price, which is common practice within health technology assessment and cost-effectiveness analysis. But of course, the actual benefits only accrue over time. And what health economists tend to do, whatever happens far in the future, is worth less today, because it's not happening now. It's only happening in, say, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So we assign a lower value to that, and that has an unusually high impact on some gene therapies that have their benefits very far into the future, but all the costs accrue today. And sort of within the JCA and as well within the HTA agencies, we see there's lots of differences between HTA agencies, how they deal with that. And this is not even part of the JCA typically, so that will not solve or make things worse either.
So you're talking about there the discount rate that's set for reimbursement. And is there any good way to decide what that discount rate would be, and why should it be different for gene therapies as opposed to other therapies?
Yeah, so I just want to make clear, like when I was talking about the discount rate for the future benefits and future costs that are generated by these therapies, not the discount rate on the price, which is something else. But if we see, and if we look into economic theory, then basically that suggests that when there is a change in how this opportunity cost of delivering a new therapy changes over time, which we see clearly with gene therapies, and essentially differential discounting, where you discount the effects on the health gains to a lesser extent. So the future health gains are still worth, almost as much today as they are when they happen in the future. And what we see with most HTA agencies, except for the Netherlands and Sweden, I think Poland and Belgium as well, they use differential discount rates, whereas all the others use the same discount rates for costs and effects. Now, by simply changing that, you see that only the choice of discount rate will potentially lower the cost effectiveness of a product by up to 50%. So that can really be a make or break in terms of whether or not a product gets reimbursed. And that impact is so profound that we really have to think like, what is the appropriate way to do the discounting? Because in the current system, this is a choice, and it has long-term implications for patients as well. I see that Jennifer wants to comment, so go ahead, Jennifer.
Yeah, if I could just very quickly add to what Lotte's saying from a health economist perspective. If you think about why gene therapies are different and why what Lotte said is so incredibly important, is gene therapies are a one and done, once off treatment, right? So when you're discounting the cost, it's only discounted in the first year. But the benefit that the patient receives is, over a lifetime. And so the benefit is discounted over time, but not the cost. So that mismatch is unique to a one and done treatment. Whereas, as I said earlier, with traditional healthcare treatments, you're treating patients symptomatically probably over the course of their disease, like maybe a daily pill. So the discount rate makes sense over time, but not when you're talking about you pay for something up front, it's one and done, but the benefits over a lifetime. That's why you have this unique situation with gene therapies.
Okay, thank you for that, Jennifer. Mindert, drawing from your experience at NICE, what are some of the key challenges that HTA bodies face when they're evaluating gene therapies? What risk management strategies can you use? And, if you could reflect on this statement that these gene therapies deliver benefits over a lifetime, how that's viewed by the people who are doing the health technology assessments, that would be fabulous. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks very much, Natasha, for the invite. And it's great to be here with Jennifer and Lottie, who I know very well. And rather than going immediately onto the technicalities of discounting, although I would love to do that, I think it's important just to reflect on what health technology assessment is all about, because I think that's an important part of why we might do differently or not for ATMP, cell and gene therapies. So health technology assessment is by definition about choices at a population level in health and care systems. And what we are trying to do in health technology assessment is to maximize total health benefits given a certain budget. Yeah. Now that's not the case everywhere in the world. We know that across the pond they think quite differently about this. But say for those healthcare systems where they use cost effectiveness to the extent that we do in the UK and in the Netherlands and in Sweden and in other countries, that's kind of the issue. So how do we maximize total health benefits for a population? Now, it's with that in mind that HTA bodies have chosen to approach cost effectiveness by using one measure of benefit, so QALYs. And let's not go into the detail of whether QALYs are good or bad, but generally speaking, what it allows us to do is to compare different treatments for different conditions across different populations by having one currency. So that's kind of the idea behind QALYs. Now, the next thing we've decided to do is to say, okay, from the perspective of equity, let's say a QALY is a QALY is a QALY. It doesn't matter to whom it falls. Now, that turned out to be quite a good approach for a long time, until there were technologies that were addressing patient populations that might be valued differently. So remember, it's not about the technology, this is about population. So we saw that at the end of life, people started valuing length of life. Now that's debatable, but as an example, that's one of the modifiers we applied in NICE. And there are others: severity of disease, rarity of disease. And for all of those, over the years, we applied modifiers. Now, we applied them for reasons of social justice, you could say, but also to recognize that the technologies that were targeting those populations became more expensive. Now, there is a bit of a relationship between the two, particularly where it's small populations. It's difficult for companies to make a return, so the price goes up. But it's not by virtue of health technology assessment by kind of definition, that we have put all those modifiers in, is to recognize different value frameworks for different populations. So that's why when we think about ATMPs, they're addressing a patient population that might be considered different. Ultra rare diseases, ultra severe diseases. We wouldn't really change our value framework if there's an ATMP for a very common condition. So if there's an ATMP for obesity, the question is, would you change your value framework? Or do you say, well, it shouldn't be that expensive because the return on investment should be such that we don't have to change our value framework? So for me, the question at first is it right to change your value framework for those conditions those people have? And generally speaking, NICE has done so. And generally speaking, the results have been positive. What we should recognize, and this is not just about ATMPs, it's about lots of current innovation, is that these innovations come to market with a very, very limited evidence base. And there's good reasons for it. We want early patient access, we want to take risks, but therefore we need to manage those risks. And that, to your question, how do we do that? Well, I think by doing three things. One is to collaborate. We need to discuss these things early and work as a society of interested parties, for profit, not for profit, together. So collaborate. Two, be creative. Now, if you want to manage risk, you have to be creative. And three, you have to be careful what you wish for. So it can't be for everybody. You have to pick your topics carefully. So those are, you could say, the three C's of the solution to ATMPs for me.
Okay, well, that's a very helpful introduction. I think I'd just like to turn to the patient perspective and the societal value issue. Avril, from a perspective of a patient living with inherited retinal diseases, what are the most important factors that HTAs should consider when evaluating gene therapies?
Thank you. Well, for us in the retinal space, when we're dealing with patients who are affected by rare eye diseases and rare retinal diseases that affect them at different stages of their life, of course, it's quite complex. But in listening to some of the comments that have been made, it always kind of strikes me that we just fall outside of the traditional system, because people living with retinal degenerations are not necessarily frequent hospital visitors or don't access healthcare in the same way, say, for example, of people living with other rare diseases that are life limiting or, really challenging health in the traditional way we would consider health, systemically. Whereas for us and those that we represent, the real challenge is the cost really falls to the social care space as opposed to the healthcare space, but runs into the billions, not only at a national level, but in larger countries, but from a global perspective, it's a highly expensive area to support and care for people living with retinal degenerations. The supports that they require are also in the context of issues concerning mental health and well-being. And what's interesting to us in Retina International is that we have been, of course, observing the policy direction of the European Union in the context of health, and the fact that there are policy discussions happening right now where mental health should cross-cut all aspects of our lives. And yet it is such a massive issue for our community and should be valued as such in an assessment. There are also issues that are really concerning to our community. For example, issues related to access to education, the whole duration of education from early childhood all the way through into third level and beyond. And also then what happens to somebody if they do emerge from and are lucky enough to have had access to education, they don't get access to employment. We find that 25% of people living with vision impairments are employed. And when you consider that context, it's valued at 8 hours or more a week. So the cost of people living with sight loss, regardless of their qualifications, is is something that we need to consider. So I suppose it's a broader issue, and I think it fits into other areas where we see not only rare diseases but other diseases causing disability, but they just aren't assessed appropriately, and as far as we are concerned. And it's really interesting, we had a meeting of our patient cohort at a global meeting this just last year. Actually, Bart attended that as well, and it was interesting because when you talk to people who are living with these conditions at all different ages, and you explain to them the process of HTA, and you take it back a little bit, you take it back to the design of clinical trial, the regulatory aspect, what the regulators are looking for, it's kind of baffling to patients. They're saying, well, that's not really what is important to us necessarily. So we have to square the circle. And I think to Mindert's point, which is extremely important, it really is about collaboration, about finding out what are the specific issues in any patient cohort or any disease cohort. What are the priorities? How do we work together? And it must be multi-stakeholder. We need to have not only the patients, the clinicians, the healthcare providers across the board, social care, researchers, but also industry involved, maybe a collective of industry that, from a competitive perspective, to get the basics right would be very advantageous, not only to our community, but others like us, and I think society as a whole.
Thank you. But last but by no means least, considering your experience with Luxturna, how can regulators, drug companies, researchers and patients better sort of reconcile these different interests to ensure timely access to these therapies?
Very good question, Natasha, and I fully commend what has been said. Basically, I think that Meindert has mentioned early interaction, and if I can state one thing from the experience of bringing what is now known as Luxturna, which is voretigene neparvovec, a very specific gene therapy which is on the market for a very specific genetic condition of the retina. One lesson that I learned many, but the most important one is interact early with regulators, interact early with HTA representatives, and get all stakeholders on board. And indeed, the methods that we use for HTA, but also the methods used earlier on in the process at the level of FDA, at the level of EMA, these methods are not fit for purpose for these rare conditions for many reasons. Most of them have been mentioned. One thing that I learned was that Dr. Kathy High, who is the person that I think was mainly responsible for getting Luxturna to market, was engaged super early with FDA, engaged super early with EMA, sit down, see what we can get. All of these conditions, rare diseases in general, and specifically what Avril and myself know best, the IRDs or inherited retinal diseases, are very different, the one from the other. And so what people lose as far as function is concerned, visual function that is in my field, is very different. And so things that people can still do with those conditions are very different. There are people who can read a computer screen for very long time in their lives, and there are others who will struggle big time but are perfectly able to navigate rooms. What I see and what I find important is that those early engagements take into account the specifics that have partially been mentioned. Rare diseases are by definition rare, so doing clinical trials that are in a controlled fashion, like, for example, if you want to get an aspirin to market, are impossible. So there are certain risks that only can be mitigated by saying, okay, let's take the risk together. And what I mean by that is, I think personally that societies in modern countries like the EU and the US ought to also bear or take responsibility for the financial risk and the health risks that are implicated in getting a drug to market with limited data available. I am not a person who doesn't dare to bring stuff to market. I think it is paramount that we then collect data as these things come to market in phase 4 clinical trials. And for our listeners who are not into the field, these are clinical trials that are pushed to principal investigators by the regulators because not enough data have been accumulated during the process of bringing this to market. For example, for Luxturna, we are doing this and we are confirming what the outcomes were. So there are mechanisms as to how we can bring these drugs to market. And if we don't really make this a shared risk and an early interaction type of model, then drug companies are simply going to walk away because these developments cost a lot of money and they need at least to get some return on investment. I personally have seen some of the drug companies walk out of gene therapies, and I think that is something we just cannot afford. And the last thing that I would want to drop into the discussion, if you allow me, Natasha, I feel that it is not logical for the EU to not have Luxturna available to Polish patients or Greek patients because the NHSs in those countries do not think that the added value in activities of daily living is worth it. Whereas in Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Germany, and other countries, you can actually access or give access to that drug for patients. So that's not logical. And so I think across the EU, if I zoom into the EU, I think we need to do a lot better and streamline the procedures much better. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Bart. A question that arises to me for a few of you is, we're having this discussion about this particular category of medicine, right? We're not having it about RNA-based medicines. We're not having it about biologics. It seems to me that a lot of this discussion and concern is predicated on the fact that the cost of manufacturing and also the price of these therapies is just so high. And, I suppose my question, first for you, perhaps Bart, and then mine, Dirt, is this actually fundamentally a business model problem that might resolve itself as we get to platform technologies and, these therapies ultimately one day become cheaper? I don't know who would like to go first. Minder, perhaps you'd like to say something.
Yeah, well, I think it's probably fair to say that if you look at the sticker price, which is the price that is listed in public documents, say, the price of many of these ATMPs are very high. I mean, there's some of them in the millions of pounds. Now, HTA's never been too concerned about the price in itself, as long as it's fair and it's a fair representation of value. Now, generally speaking, and we started this work at NICE in 2016, so almost 10 years ago, when we did our first deep dive into cell and gene therapy by taking a almost hypothetical CAR-T scenario and see whether there was a case for value at such a price. And actually, that turned out that there is, on the basis of simply looking at evidence, value, and cost, there is a case to be made. Now, whether these products can be made cheaper, sure. I mean, everybody will be interested in that happening.
So, Bart, is this a business model problem that might resolve itself at some point?
I think it is some sort of a business model problem. The other thing we could do, and so with time, price is going to come down. One thing that makes this so costly is that also there are production-wise, for viral vectors, for example, and I'm by no means a specialist in viral vector production. For our audience, we use specific viruses to bring a copy, a novel copy of a gene, this time a good copy, to a target cell that needs it and doesn't have it by nature. And these technologies are very expensive because you obviously have to make it to the appropriate grade. But the demands often posed by EMA and FDA are such that the batch production is not streamlined enough, the batch production of the viral vectors. So you have to prove over and over again that a certain batch of viruses, which you can actually use for multiple types of gene therapies, is good enough. And so that drives up the price big time. I think with time and with streamlining of those procedures, the price is likely to go down.
Lottie, I wanted to come to you, and I want to talk about the other incentives that could be offered for manufacturers. I think one of the questions that kind of slightly troubles me is that if we change the nature of how we do a health technology assessment for one category of medicines like this, I kind of worry that perhaps in the long term you're going to work against the incentive to drive down price. So if you're permanently saying, well, look, we're going to give favourable treatment to this type of therapy. So that would be my first question. And the second one is what incentives, other incentives could we offer to the industry that might help them, really bring these drugs to market and hopefully also lower the cost and the price?
Yeah, so first let me quickly say that, what Bindel basically said, there's not really a problem with the economic value of these products having a high price if these are based on the value that they generate for patients. And then also what Bart was saying about that there is a risk, of course, if you have to make a decision to pay a high price, a couple of millions, that's a lot of money on day one. But that's a financing problem. That's not an economic problem. So thinking about how we finance these products, same as when we buy a house, that's typically a lot of money and we don't pay that up, in one go up front. We have a way to paying things over time. And in this case with medicines, even when we see they are effective. So that will help getting around this sort of business model problem. So I don't think it's really a business model problem. It's more a financing problem. Then in terms of incentives, of course, it would be really nice if prices come down over time. But one thing that drives prices down over time is when competition comes into play. Now, again, with gene therapies, the question is, will that happen? Because it's typically targeted to very small populations. Once they're treated, how many patients will be sort of, coming next that can still be treated? So the question, to what extent competition will do that trick for these therapies is an open one, though we have seen in some other areas that there's actually more competition than I think many economists would have predicted from the start. But that requires it to be attractive for companies to bring another product to market. And again, that also therefore needs to have some protection about sort of the initial price, being able to recoup the investment that has been made. So it's really like multiple things that either work together or work against each other, depending on what viewpoint you take. HTA agencies typically take more like a static viewpoint, so they look at this therapy and do not necessarily consider like life cycle cost effectiveness. And there's good reasons why they do that, but there's also reasons sort of, to counter that. So I think for companies, it would be an incentive to have the opportunity to have these creative payment models, but coupled with evidence generation so that we indeed really know what the actual value is. Because another thing I see happening now, which is not necessarily a long-term sustainable solution, is asking quite hefty price discounts from manufacturers because of all the uncertainty that is also talked about, and we all know it's unavoidable, but it's still there. So when payer wants to sort of offset some of that uncertainty by getting a lower price, the risk of that is that the next treatment will be compared against this very heavily discounted price, which does not necessarily reflect the actual value. So we're getting into sort of, again, it's sort of long-term issue there as well. So I think for me, like flexible payment models and trying to be as comprehensive and honest about this full societal value of these products is really the way to go. And I think your final point, Natasha, and I know Jennifer wants to come in, what about doing something different for gene therapies? I think it's been really good that HTA agencies did that, including NICE and other ones, like allowing having different rules, different approaches based on the diseases they are targeting, sometimes also based on the technology itself. But again, we see more and more gene therapies coming down the pipeline, which is a good thing, but it also means we cannot keep treating them as an exception. So consistency, again, bringing this back to the population level, is really, really important to make fair decisions, and also decisions that really maximize the benefit that we get from our healthcare money that we're putting in.
Jennifer, I think you'd like to come in at this point, and then Mindert.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to say, absolutely agree with Lottie on, the evidence generation piece. That is something that is incredibly important to prove the long-term value of these treatments because of the uncertainty, as well as innovative payment models, because as Lottie said, this is like a financial payment issue, right? The thing that I really wanted to add, and maybe it's for viewers that are less familiar with health economics, you have to remember some of the HTA frameworks that were invented, say, for example, the cost per quality framework, were invented in like the 1970s, 1980s, when the human genome had not been mapped. I think no one at that point had envisioned that you'd be creating anything even remotely like a gene therapy where you treat a patient up front and it's one and done. So I would argue that you need to modernize the HTA frameworks that we currently have in place. They were fit for purpose, I think, when you were looking at treatments for, say, human analog insulin or the first statins that came along. You basically give a patient every patient, regardless of their genetic makeup, the same treatment and hope that it works, right? And you had massive clinical trials to prove the benefit. That those frameworks to evaluate the value of those to patients and to society worked for those types of treatments. They do not work for the advanced treatments, and I use the word treatment because they're health technologies. They're not drugs, they're not medicines, they are health technologies, right? At the cutting edge of science. So I would argue the frameworks for HTA have not kept a pace with science, and that is why you're seeing the gap. So Natasha, when you asked about, should we treat these treatments differently, I would actually say you just need to take a step back and look at HTA as a whole and start modernizing it. And I think the solution is, many people have already said it, and it starts with collaboration, as Mindert said.
Mindert, do you want to come in on that?
Two issues. One is, Jen, to say that the 1970s were not a good time. Yeah, I'm from 1968, so I would say those were the days, where the best things were born. But you're right that, of course, it is completely inappropriate to say that you shouldn't change. And for me, the question isn't so much whether HTA should change. I think it's about society asking itself the question, what do we want to pay for? What is important for us? And if they say that that's rarity, severity, whatever, ATMPs as a technology, then so be it. So I think you're right. The third C is be careful what you wish for, the third C of my contribution. Because if you broaden the perspective, you're going to make societal choices about who you prefer health benefits apply to. So, you can get into really tricky conversations about productive people and consuming people and old and young. So be careful what you wish for in that sense. The third thing, which is what I was saying while I was off camera, is that what I'm worried about is that we are not getting the commitment of industry to participate with HTA to the extent that we might. So if you look at, I don't know whether that came across, but we looked at there's 19 ATMPs, genetic ATMPs. Half of those never got to NICE because the company decided not to submit or retracted the product from the market. And those were companies that are small. I don't know how small BioMarin is, but they're quite small, and Bluebird Bio. So my worry is that actually we've created a system where a regulator steps in early. There's massive excitement about the technology. We want it now, but HTA finds it difficult to cope. Companies can't make a submission, and only when we are facing Novartis and J&J, you're willing to do it. But perhaps you're doing it while your return on investment isn't as obvious as it might be, and we should really wait for the true evidence to appear. So yeah, I'm worried that we created this. Yeah, sorry.
We're running short on time, so I'm going to go to Lotte next. Could I ask you to keep your remarks brief? Thank you. And then I'll go to Bart.
Yeah, I just wanted to add indeed, like, at OHE, we've long been advocating for like this more broader, comprehensive health technology assessment. But as I said before, I think it's really important to understand that that doesn't mean companies or HTA agencies can sort of pick the value elements where they think they would have a positive value. So this would always be like modernizing HTA for all therapies, like -S is a good thing, and there's absolutely an opportunity. Sometimes I think people expect maybe too much from that because, some of these broader value elements can be positive, but they can also be less positive, and they will not necessarily bring a higher price. And that would be to say also to HTA agencies who don't currently do that, don't be so afraid about these broader value elements, because they would always be looked at, two sides of the coin. And the same thing for manufacturers. Do not necessarily expect that a broader perspective will get you a higher price. It could, and it should if that's the case, but it's not a guarantee. But the consistency, I think, really is to make sure we have frameworks that reflect the preferences of the population, which increasingly include these broader value elements.
Bart, you had a point to make.
Yeah, briefly. Rare diseases, by definition, are very different. So the added value of a treatment for the patient is going to be very different. Flexibility and early flexibility from the HTA assessors, also from the regulators, but also early engagement ought to focus on this specific condition with this specific treatment can have a certain added value. I remember very well our first Luxturna patient who was an end-stage disease patient. She, after the treatment, was able to actually recognize her sandwiches on her plate that she was preparing for her child. And she said, Bart, before the treatment, I couldn't see what I was doing. After the treatment, I know now what I'm doing. Who are we to then say, well, that's not valuable? And so to express that in a value outcome measure is a very difficult one. And I think early interaction and flexibility of mind to say, yes, we can agree on this is important for a patient and this is important for a patient in activities of daily living with interaction of patients who know best is actually required. And I think the psychological issues is something I would invite Avril to comment on, because I know she has a lot of research about that and knows a lot about that.
I mean, you mentioned that these are rare diseases and that makes them special, but I mean, isn't the issue that there are thousands of rare diseases, each of them with different, cost benefits? Some rare diseases will kill you after a few years, and some will disable you or progressively make you unable to cope. I mean, isn't this sort of fundamentally just hitting on the problem of affordability, Bart? I mean, isn't the issue really here that these therapies are really so expensive that countries are just struggling to see how they can afford them in an era of very tight cost constraints?
It's a good, because we're tight for time, I'll be very brief. I think that if you look at the Netherlands and Belgium, for example, I know the numbers there, approximately 10% of GDP is spent on national health services. If you look at the US, it's now around 18%, and they're not getting to about a third of their population. So I think we are rich enough to pay for this. I really don't think that the national health services cannot absorb these costs. That's one thing. Second thing, I do believe that the prices will go down. And I'll refer to Avril.
Avril, if you could keep your remarks very brief, please.
Yes, just to say, that a couple of things that, firstly, only 5%, there are 6,000 described rare diseases, but there's only 5% of those that have any even research happening in the context of providing therapeutics to them, and that's unfortunate. But also, I just want to go back to the value piece. I think it's very important, the societal, what we are willing to pay for. And we often say, if somebody goes out in a storm in a red weather warning and falls off a cliff into the Atlantic Ocean, nobody bats an eyelid about spending €1 million to rescue them. These are conversations we've had, like, what are our values in society? And as we approach an aging population as well, the context of HTA really does need to adapt and change. There are so many things that we could consider around this, but ultimately I want to refer to a point that Bart raised earlier, and that is that within the European Union, if one patient, one citizen of the EU has the ability to access a therapy, then all should. And so that is a real issue for us right now in the rare disease community, where we have an apartheid between different countries, where certain patients have access to life-changing and life-saving conditions while others don't. And that really is a mark of a society, and something that I think collectively we really need to consider further, but probably don't have time for, obviously, today.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to take one of the questions from our audience. One is, how can gene therapies to treat sickle cell disease become affordable to every patient? Maybe I'll put that to Jennifer and anyone else who'd like to answer that.
I mean, I'm not an expert on sickle cell, unfortunately, so I can't address that specific question. But what I would say is, I think we've talked quite a bit about the affordability issue, right, and how we actually solve these problems. And I think it comes down to, evidence generation to give the payers more uncertainty. It comes down to innovative payment models to deal with that financial risk over time and make it affordable. And it comes down to what Avril said, which I think is the most important thing here, is what do we value as society, and what are we willing to pay for? So I think we've largely addressed that in general about gene therapy.
Yeah, sorry. Okay. Maybe to briefly add, for the sickle cell in particular, sort of the decision in the UK, for example, particularly took into account that this is a treatment that is valuable for people who have been discriminated in the past, for example, because of race, etc. So there was an explicit consideration, again, sort of linking back to what we value as a society, that we now, while we cannot change, why that happens in the world generally, we can do our little bits within the healthcare to not make it even worse. So that was an explicit consideration, I think, and Minot can correct me if I'm wrong, that NICE took into account by giving a positive decision for sickle cell disease. So we do see that HTA disease can and sometimes will bring those societal values into play in making these decisions, which hopefully is a positive thing to sort of...
Thank Lottie for calling that out, because that was a very important part of committee's consideration, and perhaps it reinforces that HTA isn't about a computer model deciding that something is yes or no. We don't ask ChatGPT to decide for us whether a drug is valuable or not. This is about human beings hearing a case for particular circumstances that may be relevant for them to consider when making a decision. And that's about deliberation and qualitative consideration. And things like impact on mental health, impact on inequalities are critically important. Maybe not all quantifiable to the extent that industry sometimes wants, because that makes it predictable, but still very important in the final decision.
Well, Manda, you've done a fabulous job summarising, actually. My job was to draw out some insights. Well, you've done that quite well. We did talk a lot, I think. What is a technical discussion about health technology assessments is actually about what we value as a society, and whether that's reflected in these assessments. The other topic we talked about was, essentially innovative payment models, and really just generally the need to support industry in making these medicines, while also, in my opinion, making sure we focus on this issue of cost reduction over time. Thank you very much to the panel. We'll now move to the second part of today's session, and it's now my pleasure to introduce MEP Andrzej Kopnotek, I would like to thank all the speakers who are with me here today for attending this session and for your incredibly valuable contributions. Thank you also to the audience and our sponsors, J&J. So it's my duty now to welcome MEP Notek to our audience. And I'd like to just say, he's a very appropriate person to join our discussion today, having for most of his professional life worked for multinational companies in the engineering and pharmaceutical sectors. So he will obviously be skilled in these areas we're discussing today, but also since 2019, he has had a focus on issues of public health along with climate and energy. So without further ado, just to start, you've been a strong advocate for improving access to cell and gene therapies. Can you talk about how you see the current EU regulations, which came into effect in January, and how they are evaluating these innovative therapies?
Yeah, thank you for the invitation, and very good morning to all following our important debate, because this topic is important for Europe exclusively. We are lagging behind US and China in new patents, and of course we would like to improve it, not only because of the economy, but also to deliver the best treatment to EU citizens and patients. And the fact that Europe realized that we have kind of an issue, or that we are lagging behind, is also the reason that we are now drafting new legislation. Starting 25, there is a new legislation also in place. And yes, indeed, we are now about first to simplify and use joint forces. There is the environment before have not at all been ready for something complex like transformative therapies like cell and gene, and all those clinical trials and assessments were done basically on national levels, and there was a lack of cooperation between the European level and member states level, and the developers were not allowed to do joint assessments. And of course, this new situation is to allow the joint work in early stage as possible. That's the first important improvement. And the second improvement, which is still not yet already in place, but we are going the direction, is to offer on the level of the authority of the Health European Authority, EMA, full board, full team that is dedicated only to those specific one-time treatment therapies, because before this has not been the case. And of course, the core of you mentioned is the health technology assessment. So very crucial part, which needs to start as soon as possible, of course, for those therapies. And before today, Europe had not enough capacities and I would say approach to value the real socio-economic effect of that one-time treatment which stops the disease. And of course, this could have led to, let's say, not a fair evaluation of the treatments that were on the market or potentially on the market, and therefore those molecules, as I say, we are talking about food treatment, have been monetized not in Europe. So these are the, I would say, general main changes that we are now focusing on, and still we are not there yet. We are starting.
You've said that the HTA processes fall short for rare diseases. Could you elaborate on how you think these HTA frameworks should change in order to assess the value of cell and gene therapies?
Cell and gene patients are patients that are basically with rare diseases, and we don't have enough data. Okay, no one has enough data. So any joint effort which is done here is very, very important. So if the developers work together, they do the joint assessment on the EU level. This is the way how to put together the pieces of necessary for the evaluation, but also the way how to save time. And I'm pretty convinced that as well the costs.
I mean, what role do you think innovation in financing has in this respect, and should the EU play a role in this?
Of course, the advantage is clear. It's one-time treatment, but of course the costs for even a faculty hospital, if you apply treatment which costs 2-3 million euro, and you do it twice a month, your cash flow is completely out of balance. So if there is a place where I would say more European approach would help, then it is in helping to finance those treatments. And I don't mean only to finance as such, but also to provide, I would say, sustainable financing models that can bring some guarantees, help out with cash flow, and of course massively invest into the innovation, because then at the end this can be done from the European money as such, and this can also reduce the price. So definitely financing model is necessary, new financing approach to maintain the sustainability of health care systems, but as well because of the cross-border approach. In Europe, basically we have 27 health care systems, and we are at some level of cross-border approach. But when we talk about rare diseases and cell and gene therapies as a reaction, we can hardly expect that, and especially in smaller member states, the hospitals, the treatment systems will be able to offer all treatments available in Europe. So therefore, it is also important to have those financing models that citizens from State A of the European Union will be able to get the treatment, and treatment will be covered in different member states. Today it is possible, but usually it is direct payment, and often it is basically crowdfunding. In the country I know most, in the Czech Republic, we have had many of nice examples where simple person with rare disease was treated in different country, but the treatment was paid by the nation, basically by a crowd that put together the money. So definitely those beneficiary treatments like cell and gene, they need adequate corresponding financing model.
All the discussions we're having now about the affordability and the financing and the assessment, whether we should broaden the HTA assessment and what we value, all of these discussions are based on the fact that they're expensive, very expensive. But that could change. It could be that 5 years from now that these therapies are very cheap. So I think what I'm asking is, how much should we change the way we do business for this one category when, 5 years from now, the considerations may be very different?
I mean, and I don't say it as a negative statement. Those therapies will never be as cheap as if you get the medicine for high fever. Yeah? That's of course, that will never be the case. It's not even possible. It's basically patient made, customized customized medicine. But of course, in the volume is the power. Where I see great future, and this is where we can go, is for the newborn screening. Okay, so the future where we shall go is that when newborn is we have a baby newborn, it's screened whether it has or not some genetic issue. Of course, if the parents are interested, it's not mandatory. And in that case, when you find quite not a big cost, answer yes or no, In case of yes, you can go deeper, and you can have of course then the treatment. And if we go in kind of a by a higher scale, of course, it can get cheaper. And what we need today in order to maintain those treatments in Europe and also to grow in Europe is to look on the health technology assessment through, I would say, complete socio-economic add value. And of course, this is very difficult to assess, because on one side you have for one application quite strong high price. However, what is the price of improved whole family life if, for example, the patient is basically stabilized at the early stage of the disease, instead of having X decades of years of whole family life vastly influenced by having someone suffering from genetical disease. So definitely, I mean, we should also take into consideration that this is a trend. Public calls for more action towards the rare diseases. In 5 years, as you correctly mentioned, the situation shall be, and in other parts of the world, either in US or other places, will be going the direction and will be different. Europe shall not be behind. So of course the HTAs shall be done accordingly with adequate resources, with adequate possibility for joint initiatives, and of course also with those I would say fast tracks, which are for, I would say, high-tech, brand new or highly innovative treatments, and also Europe is playing with this tool, and this is what I think I would recommend and hope this we are going to push through all the different legislation that we are now currently having either just started or being in the pipeline of the legislative process.
Andre, thank you very much for your time. I'm sure our listeners will find that a very useful insight into the topic. Thank you very much.
Many thanks for the invitation, and I would like to wish all the good day. Thank you very much.